Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you for convening this resumed 10th emergency session of the General Assembly in response to the request of the Arab and the OIC groups. I have the honor of delivering this statement on behalf of a group of countries which include Algeria, Bolivia, China, Cuba, Egypt, Eritrea, Islamic Republic of Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Libya, Nigeria, Syrian Arab Republic, Venezuela, and my own delegation, Pakistan. Mr. President, we are witnessing a human tragedy of epic proportions unfolding in front of our eyes. Israel's indiscriminate bombardments from the air, land, and sea, along with intense ground operations across Gaza, has now continued for over 2 months, killing more than 18,000 people, 70% of them women and children, and wounding close to 50,000. Entire families and neighborhoods have been wiped out. According to recent reports, the number of people killed is the highest in proportion to the population since this century began. Palestinians are being bombed without mercy or compunction. Their essential lifeline of water, food, medicines, and fuel have been cut off. 1.93 million of the 2.2 million Gazans have been internally displaced, and even those displaced cannot hide from the Israeli bombs. According to the UN Secretary General, I quote, "The people of Gaza are being told to move like human pinballs, ricocheting between ever smaller slivers of the south, without any of the basics for survival. But nowhere in Gaza is safe." Unquote. 134 staff members of the UN Relief Works Agencies, UNRWA, in Palestine have tragically lost their lives, many with their families and their homes. This is the highest ever recorded killing of United Nations personnel in the history of the United Nations. The international community should honor their memory. UNRWA and other UN agencies have been at the forefront of playing a critical role in the provision of humanitarian assistance to the people of Gaza. We salute their untiring efforts and commitment. The letter recently addressed to you, Mr. President, by the UNRWA Commissioner General Philippe Lazzarini at, I quote, "the darkest hour in the agency's 75-year history," unquote, reminds us that the, quote, "humanitarian situation is now untenable," unquote. Lazzarini has, I quote, "implored the General Assembly to take action," unquote. Mr. President, we are appalled at the magnitude of the suffering being faced by the helpless Palestinian civilians, especially children and women. The collective punishment endured by the besieged people of Gaza is unprecedented in modern history. We must also be appalled at those who, by blocking the call for ceasefire in the Security Council, have enabled the continuation of the Israeli slaughter of innocents. We laud the Secretary General for invoking Article 99 of the UN Charter, the first time during his tenure, terming the situation being at a breaking point. He has noted in his letter addressed to the UN Security Council that, and I quote, "there is a high risk of the total collapse of the humanitarian support system in Gaza, which would have devastating consequences," unquote. He particularly stressed that, and I quote again, "there is clearly a serious risk of aggravating existing threats to the maintenance of international peace and security," unquote. We deeply regret that calls from the UN Secretary General and the UN General Assembly have not been heeded by Israel, and it continues its criminal attacks against the Palestinian people. Israel has also ignored the call from the Security Council to comply with its obligations under international law, including international humanitarian law, notably with regard to the protection of civilians, especially children, and to refrain from depriving the civilian population in the Gaza Strip of basic services and humanitarian assistance indispensable to their survival. We strongly and unequivocally condemn the indiscriminate use of force by Israel, Israel's attacks on civilians, civilian objects and infrastructure, blockading of water, food and fuel, as well as the forced displacement of people within the occupied territory are flagrant violations of international humanitarian law and amount to war crimes and crimes against humanity and may amount to the crime of genocide. Mr. President, we are deeply disappointed that the UN Security Council once again failed to call for a ceasefire in Gaza on 8 December, even in the face of a human tragedy of epic proportions taking place there. This is unjustifiable. Despite the invocation of Article 99 by the Secretary General and his warnings of humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza, the Council has failed to perform its primary responsibility. Continuation of Israel's campaign in occupied Palestine is aggravating human suffering with massive civilian casualties and forced displacement of millions of Palestinian people. It could also trigger a wider and more dangerous conflict. A heavy responsibility rests on all who have contributed to the prolongation of uninterrupted bombing of the people of Gaza. We reject Israel's portrayal of its aggressive actions as anti-terrorism measures and its relentless bombing of Gaza as an exercise of self-defense. The root cause of the crisis lies in Israel's prolonged occupation and denial of Palestinians' inalienable right to self-determination. Israel's murderous campaign against the occupied people of Palestine struggling for their freedom cannot be justified under the guise of self-defense. Mr. President, the joint extraordinary Arab and Islamic summit held in Riyadh on 11 November 2023 underscored the centrality of the Palestinian cause and extended full support for the legitimate struggle of the Palestinian people to liberate all their occupied territories and the need to end the Israeli aggression against the Palestinian people. Described the ongoing Israeli aggression as a retaliatory war crime that cannot be justified under any guise, and demanded that all countries stop exporting weapons and ammunition to the occupation authorities that are used by their army and terrorist settlers to kill the Palestinian people and destroy their homes, hospitals, schools, mosques, churches, and all their properties. We welcome the diplomatic efforts undertaken by the Ministerial Committee mandated by the Joint efforts will lead to restoring and reinvigorating the peace process. We consider it necessary to intensify international efforts in the search for a durable and peaceful solution. Therefore, we reiterate the demand to advance the peace process in accordance with the resolutions of the Security Council, the UN, and the Arab Peace Initiative aimed at finding a just and comprehensive solution and establishing an independent Palestinian state according to the 1967 borders with East Jerusalem as its capital. We also welcome the efforts undertaken by Egypt, Jordan, and Qatar to facilitate the provision of humanitarian assistance for alleviating the suffering of the Palestinian people. Mr. President, in conclusion, it is our hope that the resolution A/ES 10/22 adopted by the General Assembly, acting under Uniting for Peace process, which seeks an immediate humanitarian ceasefire, will be implemented. The Israeli killing machine must be stopped in Gaza and the West Bank. In addition to an immediate humanitarian ceasefire and provision of unimpeded humanitarian access to the besieged people of Gaza, we also demand the following. 1. Establishment of a special tribunal and accountability mechanism to to investigate Israel's atrocity crimes, identify and prosecute those responsible for war crimes committed, and to provide reparations for damage, loss, or injury arising from these crimes committed by the Israeli occupation forces. 2. Establish an international protection mechanism to protect Palestinian civilians, especially women and children in Gaza and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, from further attacks and oppression by the occupation forces and extremist colonialist settlers. And 3. We consider it necessary to intensify international efforts in the search for a durable and peaceful solution of the Palestine question. I thank you, Mr. President.